So I'm Sarah Young. Like Denise said, I was a historian, now I'm a developer. I work at a company called Unruly, who does video ad tech. That's all explanation I'm going to do, because if I start talking about video ad tech, I will be here for about 5 hours. In any case, this talk was inspired by some reading I did around the imposter syndrome, because I was really struggling in the role I was a year ago, or 2 years ago, I think at this point. And I wasn't really satisfied with the conversation that we have around the imposter syndrome. It wasn't quite making me happy. It wasn't fulfilling all the questions I had. So full disclosure, I am a gender historian. I have studied a lot of the topics I'm going to be covering today. I do want to say that this is research I've done on my own. I don't have a degree in psychology. That doesn't necessarily make me a fraud standing up here, but I do want to take ownership of the kind of limits and boundaries of my knowledge. And I think it would be a bit egotistical to assume that I know everything. I know some, and I'm excited to learn more from all of you. So imposter syndrome, I'm sure most of us are familiar with it. For those who aren't, it's the sensation or the feeling that we don't belong, that we are not talented enough, not smart enough, not good enough for this particular role. We don't really maybe belong in the particular community that we are in, and it can lead to very strong feelings of anxiety, depression, frustration, which I totally identified with a few years ago. The psychology of fear, and actually studying the psychology of fear, put a lot of this into perspective for me. The anxiety that we feel is a defense mechanism our brains have been perfecting over millennia. You know, the fear that we feel is there to protect us. And a lot of the fear that is associated with the imposter syndrome and the anxiety is social rejection. And social rejection is actually a very deeply held fear that psychologists have studied. If you're interested to know more, there's a book called Rewiring the Anxious Brain, which was really, really influential in how I thought about anxiety, and how knowing more about how my brain worked helped me understand how I was experiencing the imposter syndrome. There is a problem, however. I think that the way we talk about the imposter syndrome puts too much onus on the individual to fix their problem, right? And I did a quick Google search of the top articles in the last few months around the imposter syndrome, and the focus is continually on the individual. How can you be more confident? How can you speak up more? How can you figure out your own anxieties, blah, blah, blah. And to some extent, yes, that is really, really helpful. But my worry and my concern is that if we ignore external factors to what someone who is experiencing the imposter syndrome is going through, we might be missing half of the picture, and we might not be able to actually have a meaningful impact on our colleagues and the people around us. That's the problem I'm seeing. Too much focus on the individual, not enough about what the community can do for the individual. So let's unpack things. By the way, I recently started fostering a cat, so this presentation is going to be full of cat pictures. He's adorable. That's not him, but I wish it was. So let's start by talking about the learning process. I come also from an education background. I was a teacher. I went through teacher training. I taught. And one of the things I realized, and this was perfectly articulated by Alicia Liu, who's the head of engineering at a company in the United States, is that there's a difference between being a beginner and having the imposter syndrome. And often what people describe as the imposter syndrome is really the first steps of learning anything, or even, you might have 5 or 6 years of experience and tackle something that's completely new, which happens a lot in our field, right? And you don't know what it is, and you're a beginner. Those are two kind of separate concepts. The learning process, for me, fundamentally, is you experiment, you fail, you learn, and you repeat. That is pretty much what you do when you try. And people who've taken care of little kids, you see this all the time, right? Kids are so good at this. They fail, they fall down, they get back up, they run again into the door, just to see what happens. This is pretty much what I do on a daily basis, right? When I program, I experiment, I fail, I learn from that, process repeats. That's not necessarily the imposter syndrome, that is being a beginner. Mindset. There's research coming out that sort of questions the assumption I think most of us have in the room that our mindset and our ability, our intellectual ability in particular, is fixed. Raise your hand if you have ever heard someone say, or have yourself said, I am not a math person, right? That's a fixed mindset. That is, to some extent, assuming that we will never be able to go beyond what our brains are capable of. Like, I will never know math, or like never be good at algebra. And I was convinced of this for the longest time. Research by Carol Dweck, it says that this is not actually true. Our brains are pretty elastic. They're pretty fluid. They're pretty flexible. They actually can accommodate a bunch of learning. And if we think about all the things that we don't know, and maybe all the things that we're not good at right now, as just realms of possibility, then that kind of changed my perspective on feeling like I didn't belong as a developer because I'd been a historian, now I was doing something completely different, right? I realized that there's a lot of power in the word yet. I don't know really the depth of databases yet. I will know, and I can know, and whatever limitation I have, that's something to some extent, I am putting on myself, right? But that's sort of the context around learning. And it's important that we kind of promote this idea of fluidity and learning and elasticity, because I feel like when we talk about learning, we perpetuate this fixed mindset. And that's not helpful for people who are currently experiencing imposter syndrome. So in the top hemp bar, those are little emojis that don't translate very well sometimes, sadly. But they're tools, because I want everyone to go away from this presentation with a few tools. First of all, learn to teach. My teacher training, by far, is the most valuable training I have ever had in my entire career. Full stop. Learning to teach people was so valuable and has been valuable for me as a developer. Being able to teach senior developers how to teach has been really valuable for me. So I think it's something that we should provide access to. Provide strong mentoring and coaching, kind of going back to the first point. Challenge the fixed mindset perspectives. I think that's something that we can all do, not necessarily putting the onus on a person, but as a community we can get behind that. Stereotyping. I want to talk about stereotype star because there are a few sort of subtopics within this. So in software development, there are a few cultural stereotypes that I'm pretty sure most of us would be familiar with. We've got kind of like the rock star diva developer who shows up whenever, I wish I looked like that though. We got the ninja developer stereotype, can just like, quickly create code and ship it out. You've got sort of the Sheldon Coopers of the world, and the sort of wizard developers who can look at a problem and solve it like that. These are cultural stereotypes. Most of the developers I've met don't always live up to these stereotypes. I think actually the developer community is a lot more diverse than the cultural representations and cultural stereotypes can accommodate. And I think that if we perpetuate these stereotypes and we continue to either give them too much value culturally, it means that people might look at those stereotypes and say, well, I'm not one of those, therefore I do not belong, right? We also kind of have a demographic stereotype, which by the way, one of the most fun things you can do on Google Images is start typing in professions and see the pictures that come up, because that's really, really fun. It's a very educational experience. Anyway, so I Googled software developer, and this is what Google tells me a software developer looks like. Again, this kind of goes back to this idea of belonging. If I don't feel like I belong in this particular community, I look around and I'm maybe the only one who's kind of like me. My comfort levels might go down a bit. We should think about that. Stereotype threat. I love XKZD. Stereotype threat is actually a little bit more complicated than this cartoon synthesizes, but it's along the same lines. Stereotype threat, it's, as Steele and Anderson, those are the two social psychologists who developed the concept, they say it's a stereotype threat refers to being at risk of confirming a negative stereotype stereotype about one's social group. And the more research I did into this, the more I was interested to learn that stereotype threat can be experienced by pretty much anyone who falls into some type of marginalization. So my dad, who is he just turned 70. So when he goes into a PC world, he gets really anxious because he knows there's a stereotype of old guys who don't know how to work with computers. And he's kind of right. He's definitely a novice. But that's a threat that has an impact on how he's able to make decisions, right? The research, more current research around stereotype threat indicates that stereotype threat most commonly appears during an activity which is considered to be very stressful, in particular a test, right? It's considered to be, to sort of come out and be around when you're facing a problem that you don't know how to solve, the voices of self-doubt get a microphone. That's kind of stereotype threat. And so I probably have personally felt this whenever I was trying to solve a problem I really was struggling with, and I was like, oh my God, I can't do this. I really can't do this. This is hard. I really shouldn't be here. Who am I to think that I can solve this problem? I am a historian. What the hell do I know? Sorry, excuse my French. What do I know about microservices? What do I know about I/O in Java, right? In that instance, my ability to problem solve, to be creative, is damaged. It goes down. I can't really think straight because my brain is full of all these voices of self-doubt. Knowing that that's the process that a person is going through, for me, helped me pair better with more developers who are starting out on their journey. Being able to recognize the signs of their own anxiety and be able to step back from the situation and say, let's talk about something that you do know. Let's go back to a place of comfort, right? And then we'll tackle this problem together. That gave me a bit of insight. So stereotype and imposter, what does that have to do with each other? Kind of like what I was talking about, being able to recognize the way that stereotyping, cultural stereotypes, demographic stereotypes, stereotype threat can have an impact on a person's levels of anxiety and the way that they feel like they belong. That's kind of what I want us to get towards as a community, that we should be challenging these norms. We should be supporting folks who challenge the norms, get more historians who are developers into the software development community, and maybe nudge the demographics a little bit. Primarily to sort of raise awareness around what we can do as a community for the people who are currently experiencing imposter syndrome. Gaslighting. Okay. This is a tough one for me to talk about. So gaslighting is basically emotional manipulation to try to convince another person that what their lived reality is does not exist. It's imaginary, right? It comes from a 1944 film called Gaslight, which is about a husband who tries to convince his wife that she's crazy by adjusting the lights. And if she's crazy, he can send her off to an insane asylum and get all her money, because that's what you could do in the 19th century. It typically, or as it was first developed, refers to abusive relationships, and it is most commonly seen in relationships of domestic abuse, right? Why am I talking about it in terms of the professional space? It broadened its definition to refer to the sensation of not being believed that a person can feel. I experienced a particular reality. I'm telling you that this happened, and you're telling me that didn't happen the way I thought, right? Currently, we are learning that kind of abusive relationships in the professional space might exist to a greater extent than we initially thought, right? That we maybe should be a bit more open-minded to the idea that, abuse of power does happen in the professional space. And if we don't talk about gaslighting, if we put the onus and responsibility on the individual to figure out their confidence, we might be ignoring some pretty problematic behavior. That was really hard, so we're going to look at a picture of a kitten to all calm down. It's adorable. So self-doubt, oh, my emoji didn't work, that's so sad. That's like neutral face and then sad face. Gaslighting basically increases your level of self-doubt, right? You have an instance of where you've been gaslighted, your self-doubt goes up, maybe things get better, happens again, goes up, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Why does this have to do with imposter syndrome at all? One thing I want to sort of differentiate is that kind of abusive relationship and that dynamic of emotional manipulation, and more the how do you handle like rhetorical disagreement? Like where is that boundary between I have a different interpretation of what happened and I am intentionally manipulating you to make you think that what happened didn't happen, right? I can't define that line. That's what I kind of feel social psychology world can do. What I can do is make a point that gaslighting does increase our sense of anxiety. It can encourage people to feel like they don't belong in this particular space because they're not being believed when something happens. The other point I want to make is that communication is hard. Communication is a lot harder than I think I really, I took for granted. I can talk, it's not a problem. But it's actually very, very difficult. And what helped me was understanding something called the interactive model of communication, which outlines, this again comes from sort of social psychology. Messages get sent, right? That kind of elicits a sense of meaning in a person, that triggers feelings about meaning, which activates feelings about those feelings, which can evoke, not always, a defense mechanism, which requires rules for commenting, which directs a response. That is basically that is me saying hello to you. That process just happened, right? It happens so fast, we can barely notice it, right? That's why our brains are incredible, and I kind of wish I had studied neuroscience instead of history. Almost, not quite. That part of the interactive model, I am really, really interested in. The feelings about the meaning, which activate the feeling about feelings, because I feel like this is a tool for us to handle those instances of gaslighting. Because when you hear someone describe a situation, our gut or my default response is to try to rationalize or help explain, and to some extent that can feel like I'm diminishing the person's experience. I see someone come to me, they're really upset. I say, oh, he probably didn't mean it that way. She was just joking. They didn't mean to come across like that. That can be my default response because I want to calm the person down. They're obviously upset, right? Instead of that process of rationalization, we can go through a process of validation, because those feelings and the feelings about the meaning and the feelings about the feelings that the person's going through, those are pretty real. That's something they are experiencing in the moment, and to some extent they really want those to be validated, right? This is why I would really encourage all people, all companies to learn about communication tools like active listening and validation, right? Validation means when you go to someone says to you, describes a situation, you say back to them, that sounds really frustrating, I'm so sorry that happened. That's validation. You want to recognize that what they are feeling in this current moment is valid, that their feelings have a place, that they have been listened to, right? Trust and verify. Trust that the person is describing their own reality, and then get context. It doesn't have to be in that particular moment, but verify and gather context. Be mindful and compassionate about those kind of social interactions. Gaslighting is a tough one to talk about, which leads us on to another sort of more difficult social psychology concept called micro-messaging. Micro-messaging, basically, if I roll my eyes, I have just sent you a micro-message, right? Oh God, that person's so boring, right? Micro-messaging is typically nonverbal, so it's body language. If it is verbal, it can be intonation, it can be sort of kind of sublingual, ways of conveying small bits of meaning. And our brains are so good at this, right? You can tell when you make eye contact with a person in a meeting, you're micro-messaging. It's a tiny, tiny, tiny message, facial expressions, right? They're passing, they're hard to see. They are manifested in sort of two types of sort of subsets of micro-messaging. One is called micro-affirmation, one's called micro-inequity. Micro-affirmation is pretty easy to start with, so we'll go there. It was developed as a concept by social psychologist Mary Rowe in the 1970s. She was studying along with the scholar who studies microaggression. And I guess one thing to keep in mind is the time in which they were studying. This is in the 1970s. This is, we're either like, we've just passed the height of the civil rights movement, where lots of civil rights legislation has been enacted. People are talking about discrimination, but they're talking about discrimination at this sort of like systemic level. And social psychologists are beginning to say, well, hold on a second. If we pass all these laws, will that just fix everything? No. So the social psychologists began to look at sort of the micro interactions that people have with each other. So micro-affirmation is basically a way to communicate that you support, value, or validate an individual. And it's a very small interaction. It's passing, it's hard to see. I might be unconscious of it, you might be unconscious of it, but you are conveying a little bit of information, right? So that's, yay, I'm so happy, you've done well, and I feel happy. I mean, a good example of this, actually this happened last week. I was in a meeting, and me and this other guy started speaking almost at the exact same time, but I spoke before he did. Now, my default is to apologize to a person and say, oh, I'm so sorry, you go ahead, right? So I defaulted to the guy in the room, and he had the presence of mind to say, oh, wait, no, hold on a second, Sarah. You definitely started. I'd like to hear what you have to say. I felt so affirmed in that moment. I felt so valued. I was really impressed at my colleague, at how well he'd been able to read the situation and to take the time to help me feel validated and affirmed. And I spoke with more confidence in the seconds leading after that interaction than I probably would have without that. That's micro-affirmation. Micro-inequity. Basically the flip side. It's small, short interactions, either a micro message or an act, that typically is unintentional, unconscious, but occurs when a person is perceived as different from whatever the dominant group is, right? That can be kind of like sort of smirking, making a joke that in some way marginalize someone who's already marginalized. I know, it looks way better on my slides, don't worry. It's an unhappy cat and two people laughing at the unhappy cat. What's harder to see is when those micro-inequities are completely come across as benign. You have no idea it's happening. But the person on the receiving end of them can recognize it as a micro-inequity. They know that they have felt marginalized, right? Again, this means that communication is hard. This is a reminder to me in this research about micro-affirmations and micro-inequities that communication is really, 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 really hard. We would like to think that communication can happen in a void. I am talking to one person, they're talking back to me, and that's it. We are just exchanging words. That's all that is happening. We are maybe a bit of meaning, I need you to do this, blah, 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 blah. It's not quite what social psychology tells us, psychology tells us, anthropology tells us, and history tells us. What's closer to the truth is you've got two people, right, who bring to that conversation their own personal history, their own perspective, their own cultural past, right? Their own psychology. They exist themselves within a local social structure and a local sort of how they relate to each other. Who are we in this sort of social stratification, right? Which we do, I mean, social hierarchy exists not as a bad thing, but because we're like apes and then we evolved and this is kind of how humans work, right? So outside of the sort of social hierarchy, conversation also exists within a cultural domain, right? What am I culturally conveying in this conversation? What are the expectations that we have in the culture that we are currently in, not necessarily the culture that we came from, right? On top of that, you have history. How many times has a conversation like this happened, not just in my life, but in the lives of other people I know, right? Is this conversation that I'm currently having right now like so many thousands of other conversations that may have happened in years before I was born, right? How is this a reenactment of something that's happened again and again and again and again? This is where studying history gets really useful, because you're able to identify these patterns. But I think we need to be aware of the ways in which communication really isn't happening in a void, that there are all these other factors that come into play in conversation. And what I like about the research around micro-affirmations and micro-inequities is that it kind of takes into account that complexity, right? And also, to some large extent, gives us the tools not only to address the anxiety that people feel when they are receiving micro-inequity, but also the tools to help maybe ease that sense of anxiety, right? So if we think about the two factors in the imposter syndrome, the anxiety and the sense of not belonging or feeling like you're a fraud, a micro-affirmation can do a lot to help ease that sense of anxiety, to reinforce the belief that a person belongs. So what are the tools that you can do? Again, practice micro-affirmations, support coaches and mentors, make sure that they have a good understanding of what, like, the complexities around communication, support people who are interested in these kind of topics. As developers, I would love every developer I work with to be as good at tech and programming as they are at the tech of human interaction, right? The complexities around communication. Provide tools to give constructive feedback. One of the things that we do in Unruly, which I'm so proud of, is we have something called Feedback and Cake, where we get sort of mini training on how to give constructive feedback, and then we all get together and we eat cake, we break bread, and we give each other feedback, and that creates a sense of psychological safety. So when a micro-inequity comes up, I feel 100% comfortable to go to a colleague and say, hey, let's start a conversation about this, right? And it's an incredibly empowering environment in which to work. And I think that it provides tools for us to address as a community, as opposed to the individual, some of the sort of roots of anxiety and factors in the imposter syndrome. So wrapping it up, because I really want to get to some questions from y'all. I highly recommend learning about the psychology of anxiety and fear. It's fascinating. It really, really is. Be aware of external factors. Some of the things I've mentioned before. Be aware of gaslighting. Do your own research on this. Micro-messaging. Highly recommend looking into it. Be aware of things like stereotype threat. And then create supportive and inclusive communities, which it sounds like Pivotal does a really good job of. So that's probably what I would say.